It started with static. That's the thing nobody talks about when they report on what happened that Tuesday in March. They talk about the lockdown, about the prints, about the recording. They don't talk about the static, that small, wrong sound coming from behind the East Garden wall that made Corporal James Whitfield stop walking his post at 6:47 in the morning. Static, like a radio left on somewhere. He stopped. 12 years on the palace rotation, and he knew the sounds of that courtyard the way a pianist knows a familiar key going slightly flat. The fountain near the gate. The specific creak of the iron hinge on the service entrance. Pigeons on the chimney stack, always three, always the same three, or maybe always new ones who'd learned the same bad habit. He knew those sounds. Static was not one of them. I need to back up a little, because the morning before any of this happened, London was doing what London does in mid-March, pretending it might be spring and then laughing at you for believing it. The sky was that particular shade of gray that locals call fine and tourists call depressing, and the tourists on the south pavement outside the palace gates were already 4 deep by 6:30 a.m., cameras raised, breath fogging. I was among them, technically. 3rd time in London. 2nd time standing outside this particular set of gilded gates hoping for what? A glimpse of something real inside. All that ceremony? A curtain moving? I don't entirely know. There's something about this place that makes ordinary people feel like if they stand still enough and look hard enough, they'll catch the institution off guard. Like the palace might forget itself for 1 second and show you what it actually is. Most days it doesn't. That morning was different. The changing of the guard wasn't due until 11, so the guards on early rotation were doing the thing guards do when tourists are watching, but nothing ceremonial is scheduled. Standing exactly still, staring at exactly nothing, performing the art of human absence while very much present. It's impressive, honestly. The discipline involved. The way they make their faces go somewhere else while their bodies stay at their post. Whitfield wasn't doing the still standing. He was a roving corporal, one of the ones you don't usually notice because they move in quiet, measured loops rather than standing at the famous sentry boxes. Less photographed, more purposeful. He was the kind of guard who existed in the corner of tourist footage, a blur in the background, part of the scenery. Except that morning he stopped. I noticed because everyone else was pointing cameras at the main gate, and this one guard, maybe 40 meters to the east along the outer wall, had just become very, very still in a way that felt different from ceremonial stillness. This was the stillness of someone listening. He turned his head, just slightly, chin down, like a dog who's caught a frequency no one else can hear. The woman beside me, older, American, wearing a waterproof that crinkled when she breathed, said, "Is he okay?" I didn't answer. I watched. What Whitfield found, and this is based on what came out later, piece by piece, the way these things always come out, through sources and briefings and the odd detail that slips into a journalist's notebook, what he found was a device. Small, the size of a cigarette lighter, tucked into the stone recess of the wall at a height of about knee level, where the old drainage channel ran along the base of the East Garden perimeter. A recording device. Not military. Not police. The kind of thing you can order off the internet for £43, delivered next day, no questions. Civilian grade, but decent range. And it had been there long enough that the morning damp had started to fog the casing. Not hours. Days. What it had recorded, nobody said publicly. Not in full. But the fragments that leaked, and they always leak, don't they, even from places that theoretically don't leak, pointed towards something that made the morning shift supervisor go white when Whitfield brought it to him. Something that involved a specific stretch of the East Garden, a specific time of day, a specific small voice asking a question about butterflies. Princess Charlotte's voice, 9 years old, out in the garden with a household staff member 3 days earlier for what was supposed to be 30 minutes of unscheduled private outdoor time. The kind of break that doesn't make the calendar, doesn't make the briefings, doesn't make any public record at all. Somebody had known she would be there. The shift supervisor's name, I don't have. The records don't say. What the records say, in the carefully worded internal communication that was later partially disclosed, is that he contacted the residential security detail at 6:54 a.m. and that within 11 minutes, three things happened simultaneously. The East Garden gate was locked. The tourist-facing entrance was quietly, without announcement, moved to controlled entry. And Prince William was woken up. Now, here's where I have to tell you what it looked like from the pavement, because the pavement is where I was, and the pavement is where things looked normal for much longer than they should have. 7:05 a.m. The light was getting better. Someone on my left had started a thermos of coffee, and the smell was making everyone nearby subtly lean toward him. A child in a yellow raincoat was pressed against the gate, mouth open, waiting. Her father was explaining, in patient, repetitive English, that the guards don't move, and no, they can't make them laugh, and yes, we can come back later. Nothing looked wrong. That's the thing about proper security response, the good kind, the trained kind. It doesn't run. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't do anything that would make 40 tourists on a pavement start filming on their phones and narrating to their followers. It just quietly rearranges. A body moves here. A door closes there. The geometry of a space shifts, and you almost don't notice because each individual change is so small. But I noticed, because the guard in front of the East Gate, the one who'd been there when I arrived, was gone. Replaced. The replacement was standing in a slightly different position, weight differently distributed, eyes doing a wider, slower sweep. And the small door in the outer wall, the one that servants and deliveries used, the one that opened and closed on a routine I'd half unconsciously memorized over an hour of standing there. That door had not opened in 20 minutes. The American woman with the waterproof said, "Is something going on?" I still didn't answer. I found out later, much later, from a contact who works adjacent to this world, close enough to know, but far enough to talk, that Prince William was in the briefing room by 7:30. He didn't come in hot. That's what I was told. He came in quiet. There's a difference, and people who've seen both will tell you the quiet version is worse. The hot version is manageable. Someone is venting, something is happening, energy is being discharged. The quiet version means someone has gone somewhere inside themselves where they make decisions that last. He asked 3 questions. How long had the device been there? Who on the external schedule might have known about Charlotte's garden time? And whether the recording had been accessed remotely, whether someone had already listened to it, or whether it was still local on the device. The third question was the one that made the room tighter, apparently, because they didn't know yet. The technical team was still working it, which meant there was a window, possibly a very recent window, in which someone might have heard his daughter's voice being broadcast to wherever the receiver was. A 9-year-old asking about butterflies, sent somewhere, to someone who had gone to the trouble of hiding a device and waiting. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "Full lockdown protocol, East Wing, all external access suspended pending sweep, and give me the list of everyone who had visibility on the residential schedule for the past 2 weeks." Not a request. The other kind. Back on the pavement, none of this was visible. 7:45 a.m. The changing of the guard announcement came over a tourist phone app, the one that sends notifications about royal schedules, and the crowd shifted and grew. More people arriving. The yellow coat girl had given up on making the guard laugh, and was now sitting on her father's shoulders, high enough to see over the gate, looking into a courtyard that had been quietly emptied of everything except ceremony. The crinkle waterproof woman had gone. New people had taken her spot. A street vendor 20 meters down was selling Union Jack umbrellas and small enamel pin badges of the royal family, including one of Princess Charlotte that caught the improving light and glinted. I looked at it for longer than made sense. Something had happened this morning, and I was standing 20 meters from where it happened, and I wouldn't know the weight of it for weeks. That's how it works with places like this. You stand outside. You look in. You see the surface and the ceremony and the beautiful locked, intentional performance of continuity. And underneath it, behind the East Garden wall, 3 days of recordings and a father woken before 7 and a question about butterflies going somewhere unknown. The umbrella vendor made a sale. The guard in front of me didn't blink. The morning moved on. There's a particular kind of silence that buildings make when they've been locked down. Not empty silence. Not the silence of a room with nobody in it. Something denser than that. The silence of a space that has been deliberately held. Every door accounted for, every window checked, every person inside reduced to a name on a list that someone is looking at. A silence with weight to it, like the building is holding its breath. Kensington Palace held its breath for most of that Tuesday. I wasn't inside, of course. Nobody who shouldn't have been was inside. What I'm telling you now comes from 3 weeks of conversations and one coffee that lasted 2 hours longer than it should have, with someone who was a peripheral presence in the event of that morning, peripheral enough to be unimportant to the investigation, close enough to have stood in the corridor outside the briefing room and heard the temperature of the voices inside. I'll call him David because that's not his name. David had been at Kensington for 6 years. Not close protection, not the inner ring. One ring further out, the kind of role that involves coordination and logistics and the management of schedules that can't appear on any public-facing calendar. He was, in his own words, the person who knew where people were going to be before they knew themselves. That sentence took on a different texture when the device showed up. The sweep began at approximately 8:10 a.m. Not just the East Garden, the whole external perimeter, then the accessible interior, the garden-facing rooms, the service corridors, any space that had line of sight to areas where the children had unrestricted movement. The technical team came in quietly, equipment in cases that looked like camera bags, the kind of gear that wouldn't register as unusual to anyone watching from outside. They found 2 more devices. This is the part that wasn't reported anywhere for a long time, and even now only exists in the margins of accounts, half sentences and long pieces about palace security reviews, the kind of detail that gets filed and then gently does not get followed up on. 2 more. One in the lower garden, near the old stone bench along the south wall. The bench that, David told me, had been a favorite spot of the children during the previous summer. One in the utility corridor off the east service entrance, closer to the interior than anyone was comfortable discussing. Not recording audio. The second and third devices were different, smaller, cruder. Still image capture. Motion triggered. Looking inward. Someone hadn't just wanted to hear. Let me tell you what David described when he talked about the moment that information reached the briefing room. He was outside. He couldn't hear words. But he'd worked near high-pressure environments long enough to read the pressure changes. The way voices drop instead of rising when something gets worse. The way the room goes from active noise to a specific kind of concentrated quiet where everyone is absorbing the same information at the same time. That quiet happened twice. Once when the second device was confirmed. Once when they told William it was image capture. It didn't make a sound, David said. That was the part that got to me. You'd expect something. A word, a chair moving, anything. But there was just nothing. For about 10 seconds. And somehow that was louder than anything. I wrote that down and then sat with it for a while before I wrote the next thing. The investigation moved fast, in the particular way that royal security investigations move, quietly, with a thoroughness that civilian processes can't fully match, drawing on resources that don't appear in any public budget. Forensics on the devices. Signal tracing on the audio recorder. It was locally storing, hadn't yet transmitted, which was the answer to William's third question, and it was the one piece of mourning that felt like something close to relief. Charlotte's voice hadn't gone anywhere, but it had almost gone somewhere. The device had a transmission window. 3 hours from the time it was found, 6:47, it would have automatically sent the accumulated recordings to a remote address. Automatic. Scheduled. The person who placed it hadn't even needed to be nearby to collect what it gathered. 6:47. Whitfield and his static. If he'd done his loop 10 minutes faster or 10 minutes slower. If the drainage channel hadn't created that specific acoustic bounce that carried the sound up and toward him. If he'd heard it and dismissed it and moved on the way a person can always rationalize moving on when something asks something of them. But he didn't move on. He stopped. David told me about the identification of the device's origin, where it had been purchased, through what channel, and I'm not going to repeat those details here. Not because I don't know them, because some specifics matter for the investigation and not for the story, and this is a story, and the story is about something else. The story is about a father in a briefing room, About the moment he understood that someone had been watching the spaces where his daughter was supposed to be safe. Not a threat to the monarchy, not a geopolitical calculation, not one of the large abstract dangers that the security architecture is built to deflect. Something more specific than that. More personal. A camera near a bench where a child liked to sit in summer. An audio recorder capturing 30 minutes of unscheduled garden time. Whoever placed those devices knew the schedules, knew the habits, knew which moments were soft. That's not surveillance. That's a different word for it. And the word is closer and colder. By 10 a.m., David said, the list had been narrowed. Not a name yet. A category. Someone with access to the residential schedule. Not the public calendar, the real one, the one that exists only internally, and with unsupervised physical access to the East Garden perimeter during a window roughly 4 to 10 days prior. The intersection of those two circles was small. Too small to be comfortable. It's the internal thing that changes people, David said. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, even though the coffee was long cold. You deal with external threats your whole career. That's what the job is. Someone who doesn't belong here trying to get in. You train for it. You build systems for it. But when the thread leads back inside, even to the edge of inside, even to someone who barely qualifies, that changes the texture of the air. For a while, the air is different. He paused. Prince William has children who live inside that air. 11 a.m. arrived. Outside the palace gates, the changing of the guard happened exactly on schedule. The band, the ceremony, the slow ritual exchange of responsibility performed for the cameras and the crowds. Tourists pressed forward. The yellow coat girl was gone by now. I'd left the pavement an hour earlier, but there were others. There are always others. The ceremony does not fail to produce a crowd. Inside, the sweep was still running. The briefing room had shifted from crisis response to structured investigation. The palace's communications team had been brought in carefully with tight information boundaries to prepare for the possibility of a leak. Not to suppress information. To be ready when the shape of the story became clear enough to address. The difference matters. One is dishonesty. The other is the specific, legitimate discipline of not speaking before you know what you're saying. A statement was not issued that day. No one confirmed or denied. The usual nothing that means something. Charlotte, that morning, was at school. Normal Tuesday. A science lesson, I was told. Not by David, by someone else, someone even further from the center, relaying the detail the way these human chains of information relay things, each link adding a degree of remove. A science lesson. Whatever 9-year-olds study in science. The periodic table. Seeds in jars. The small, graspable magic of things growing. She didn't know about the devices. She won't know, not the full shape of it, for years. Children at this level of public life are protected from the knowledge of the machinery surrounding them until the machinery becomes unavoidable. Until they're old enough to carry that weight without it bending them. Her father carried it instead. That morning, in a room she'd never be in. He carried it the way fathers carry things. Quietly, in the place you don't let show. There's one more detail from the sweep that I keep returning to. Near the old stone bench in the lower garden, the one the second device was attached to, the technical team found something else. Not a device. Not surveillance equipment. A sweet wrapper. The foil kind, red and gold, the kind that comes on those rectangular chocolates they sell in tourist shops and certain supermarkets. Just sitting there in the grass near the base of the bench, fresh enough that it hadn't been rained on. It meant someone had been there recently, sitting maybe, waiting, watching, and then leaving behind the smallest, most accidental evidence that they had a body, that they were human, that they ate chocolate from a tourist shop wrapper while they did whatever they were there to do. David mentioned it almost as an aside. It's the detail I can't stop thinking about.